Mr. President, I want to join my colleague from West Virginia as well as our friend from South Dakota to really say how much I appreciate the effort that Senator Crapo's made to put this bill together. It's exactly how the Congress is supposed to work and how the Senate is supposed to work, a bipartisan bill, a bill that, frankly, I'm sure that everybody that will vote for this bill would have changed at least one thing in it. But if you change all of those things that all of us would have changed, suddenly you wouldn't have a bill that could pass, a bill that would do what this bill does, a bill that will roll back the Dodd-Frank regulations, the one more attempt by the federal government to make one size fits all. And if you've ever tried on any one size fits all things, you know that one size almost never fits anybody. And that's been the case that we've seen now. Credit unions and community banks provide critical financial services for families and for small businesses across Missouri and across the country. When the Dodd-Frank bill became law, small and medium-sized banks and credit unions were faced with huge regulatory burdens. Big banks got bigger, small banks got bought and went out of business way too often. The negative impacts of their ability to maintain service on Main Street in a small community, you couldn't put together a group that would just be the compliance group. And if you did, that had to come out of something else and come out of your ability to do the kind of business that you wanted to do and always had been doing. According to the Independent Community Bankers of America, despite holding less than 20% of the nation's banking assets, community banks fund more than 60% of small business loans and more than 80% of United States agricultural loans, all in that 20% of the banking assets of the country. Furthermore, they operate in many areas where other banks don't, where they're the only physical banking presence, frankly, and 1 out of every 5 U.S. counties have only one bank, and that one bank is a community bank, a small bank. The more time, the more money, the more staff that community lenders have to dedicate to complying with needless regulations, the less ability they have to provide the kind of service that you'd like to provide. The president of the Missouri Bankers Association, Max Cook, said this common sense legislation, talking about the bill that I'm pleased to be a co-sponsor of, this common sense legislation will allow banks to better serve the needs of customers and businesses in our communities. He went on to say that financial regulatory reform will unleash America's economic potential. That's the end of his quote, but I think you could add to that lots of good things are happening in our economy right now. The tax bill, the regulatory, common sense regulation that's overcoming a regulation that didn't make much sense. Access to capital is a critically important part of what you have to have a growing economy, and access to capital in small communities as well as access to capital in big communities. That means that you have to have banks that can serve the communities those banks are in. This bill contains a number of bipartisan priorities. One of the priorities in here is a bill that I sponsored, the Family Self-Sufficiency Act. Senator Rounds mentioned part of what that means to rural Americans, but it also means a lot to Americans that really are living in under public housing programs of one kind or another. This was a bill that I introduced. It was co-sponsored by Senator Reed from Rhode Island, by Senator Scott from South Carolina, from Senator Menendez from New Jersey. Another bipartisan statement that this bill will make when we pass it. And it just simply makes common sense changes in the Department of Housing and Urban Development's Family Self-Sufficiency Program. Now, that program happens to be under the Banking Committee, so it fits right into this bill. What this addition to the bill would do is, and is in the bill to start with now, it expands the ability of people under the new way to define these programs to improve their education, to save money for the future, to reach their goal of becoming more financially independent. The first thing the legislation does is streamline 2 public housing family self-sufficiency programs into one. There's no reason to have two family self-sufficiency programs, no reason to have two definitions, no reason to have one category of people in those programs who qualify for things and a second category who don't, just because they happen to qualify under the definitions of a needlessly duplicative program. So it eliminates that. This bill expands the scope of support services. It allows people that are in these programs to attain a GED if they don't have one, to pursue a post-secondary degree or a post-secondary certification, and gives training for financial literacy. Lastly, this bill would expand the reach of the Family Self-Sufficiency Act to programs that to families that may otherwise be technically excluded from these programs today. Some of the statements from housing organizations in my state and around the country, a group called Beyond Housing, who's interested in just more than a place to live, but how you use that as a way to improve your life. Beyond Housing in St. Louis, which provides more than 400 affordable housing rental units for families throughout the St. Louis region, endorsed the bill because they said it would put, quote, it would empower families across the country to achieve self-sufficiency. The Missouri chapter of the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials supports the change this bill has because they say, quote, it provides the toolbox the residents can use to better the life for themselves as individuals and as a family. The National Neighborhood Works Association says the legislation would improve the existing self-sufficiency program to help more individuals and families achieve more in life for themselves and for their family. You know, providing families in need with affordable housing is critical, but it's also important that we figure out ways to move them beyond government support to self-sufficiency. These changes in this bill help make that happen. A companion bill of that part of the bill in the House passed in January by a vote of 412 to 5. So I hope it's a helpful addition to the bill. I know it's going to be helpful to the families that it opens new doors for. Mr. President, I'm glad to be here supporting this bill, to have Senator Round, Senator Capito, Senator Enzi, and Senator Fisher here as well to talk about the importance of this bipartisan piece of legislation. And I would yield the floor.